This was one of the most disturbing books I've read this year. And I think it's important, even though I strongly disagree with much of it. Hey, this is Blighted Pine Books, and today we're going to be taking a look at Douglas Murray's On Democracies and Death Cults, Israel and the Future of Civilization. Who is Douglas Murray? If you're not already familiar, Douglas Murray is a conservative writer and public intellectual who pens clear-eyed cultural analysis. His previous works include The Strange Death of Europe, which tackles immigration in Western Europe, The Madness of Crowds, a takedown of woke ideology published in the wake of the George Floyd protests and ignited broader cultural war debates in the summer of 2020. Douglas Murray is also a close friend of Sam Harris, who, despite their political differences, aligns with Murray on immigration policy and a skepticism of the far left and cancel culture. Finally, Murray is a quick-witted, openly gay, humorous cultural critic, and even when I personally disagree with his politics, I appreciate engaging with his perspective. So what is On Democracies and Death Cults about? Well, Murray is drawn to controversy. The topic of this book, the Israel-Palestine conflict, brings out a far more emotional tone than what I recall from The Madness of Crowds, which has a pithy, mocking tone. If you do decide to read this book, I highly recommend listening to the audiobook, perhaps on Audible, which is narrated by Douglas Murray himself. Murray's absolute horror of the events of October 7th, when Hamas launched the deadliest strike in Israeli history, striking the Nova Music Festival at sunrise, murdering Jewish civilians in their homes, and taking over 250 hostages, is captured in his voice. And Murray is clearly disgusted and frightened by what he describes as the West's tepid response. Murray spends more than half of the book recounting the events of October 7th in glaring detail, but he also presents a history of Israel's relationship with Palestine and Iran, and dedicates 2 chapters to analyzing the West's response to the attack and the public and campus protest that voiced strong support for Palestine and condemnation of Israel. This book, and this will be my primary critique that I'll discuss later, it really fails to steelman the argument that Israel has significantly overstepped a moral and maybe even legal boundary in its decimation of Gaza and the punishing blockades that have led to the starvation of Palestinian children. It is, however, a book worth engaging with, no matter your perspective, but should by no means be one's only critical exposure to the debate on one of the world's most urgent moral and humanitarian quandaries. Personal note on my politics. I think we're all a bit overexposed to sensational political hot takes, so let me be clear. I don't intend to take a political stance on this channel. If you think that's a moral failure on its own, I accept your criticism. In this review, I'm going to be focusing on Murray's argumentation, but I'm not going to share my views on the war or my political perspective. Sorry. This book is emotional. The first chapter of this book was so impactful that I gifted it to a colleague. Murray's recollection of the events on October 7th are shocking, particularly his retelling of 2 events, which to me were unforgettable. The first event. Murray retells the story of a young Palestinian man who, after murdering a family of Jewish people, he calls his mother. Murray reads the full transcript of the telephone call in which the young man celebrates the murders, and his mother, sharing his enthusiasm, praises him, expressing pride in her son's slaughtering of this Jewish family. It's absolutely horrifying to know that not only did these horrific events occur, but that a person could stand over these freshly murdered innocent civilians and express no remorse. And worse, that a parent would respond as if their child had just received some kind of lifetime award. The second event. Well, the massacre of October 7th was widely covered in the West, and most are familiar with the images of Hamas terrorists paragliding over the border and dropping into the Nova Music Festival. Murray's interviews with eyewitnesses are extremely compelling and humanize the festival goers with a journalistic objectivity and even a bit of a literary touch. One such story is of the drugs that the festival goers were taking. While the moral depravity of slaughtering innocent young people at a music festival is obvious, I had not personally considered witnessing the horror of this under the influence of psychedelics. Murray notes that many at the festival had taken substances like MDMA, psilocybin mushrooms, and LSD, and that while experiencing this in a sober state was life-shattering, under the influence of a psychedelic, many festival goers became psychologically disturbed to the point of hospitalization. Murray tells the story of this one young man who found his way to his car as the attacks were ongoing, and had weirdly had the foresight to drive alone, preferring to come and go without relying on his potentially drug-addled friends. And as he was searching for an alternative, unblocked exit, he saw an even younger boy who was in a state of extreme anxiety and clearly under the influence of an unknown substance. He lay down in the back seat and immediately began screaming in a blood-curdling manner. The driver begged him to stop, saying that he needed to focus, and if they were going to exit the festival, he was going to need the kid to quiet down. But the boy simply couldn't stop. He just screamed and screamed. Finally, the driver told him, he said, "Look, you either need to stop screaming or you need to get out, because we're not going to find our way out of here." The boy told him to stop the car. He dove out of the car and took off into a field. The driver had no idea if the boy survived. Likely he did not. Stories like these truly brought to light the absolute horror of October 7th. While it's difficult to listen to or read these stories, Murray's horrifyingly detailed retelling truly does capture the depravity that took place on this day in a way that I hadn't seen anywhere else, either in the media or on social media. So this book is very critical of the West's response to these events. Chapter 3, which is titled How the World Turned, Douglas Murray explores how some in the West voiced support for Palestine and their deep concern for the deteriorating conditions of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. Murray refers to these rallies as anti-Israel rallies, interestingly. He notes that some of the protesters in London waved Islamic flags of jihad and wore stickers depicting hang gliders of the same type as those that had descended on the Nova Party. He also notes that these two girls that wore these stickers on their shirts were charged, but were later released by a quote-unquote Muslim judge. Murray depicts the crowds hanging Islamic flags on monuments, with numbers so large that the police had either lost control or did not care to take control of the Capitol. The officers later released statements of condemnation due to the police failing to arrest protesters who were inciting terrorism for yelling "Jihad, Jihad," but these protesters later claimed that jihad actually has multiple meanings. Murray then traces these protests across the Western world, writing that Emmanuel Macron in France banned public protest during this period, remaining largely tranquil on the streets in Paris. But in Toronto, Sydney, Cape Town, Johannesburg, pro-Palestine protests spread around the world. And so if you can't already tell, this book presents this conflict in binaries. Douglas Murray, who I find, he's usually a pretty nuanced writer, but he presents this geopolitical conflict as a good versus evil binary. Murray frames the conflict in stark moral terms. Hamas is not just a terrorist group, but a death cult with a genocidal mission, one he describes as worse than the Nazis because each death is openly celebrated. To support this claim, he cites gruesome celebratory videos that were shared on the October 7th attacks. He paints many Western supporters of Palestine, particularly the student protesters, as ideologically captured and misled by professors and radical narratives that are hostile to the West. So I found these arguments to be a little bit lacking. While Douglas Murray, he's one of our most important public intellectuals, I think, serving as a critic of some of our most extreme thought leaders. On this topic, He lacks nuance. There's no attempt whatsoever to present a counter argument. Those who disagree with him are just ideologically captured by terrorists or Marxist professors. Murray fails to discuss Israel's occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and presents them as just reacting to attacks throughout the 20th and 21st century rather than as actors that are capable of missteps. This book was published in April of 2025, so Murray was writing as Israel was imposing blockades, and he chooses to not acknowledge the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. As of May 28th, 54,700 Palestinians have died in this conflict, and 80% of those are civilians. And also, Murray presents Hamas's rise as a function of their hatred for the Jewish people, but he doesn't discuss how Israel's actions potentially radicalized Palestine. So, some closing thoughts on the book. Just this weekend in Boulder, Colorado, where I lived for a year, an Egyptian citizen who had sought asylum in the U.S. brought more than a dozen incendiary devices to a march in support of hostages in Gaza and threw these Molotov cocktails at a group of protesters who call themselves Run for Their Lives, a global run-walk group calling for the immediate release of hostages held by Hamas. As the war continues, both sides grow increasingly hostile, and reliable information and honest debate are the only ways to find a way forward that eases tensions. This book offers a wealth of information, but little in the way of real debate. At times, it veers into something resembling propaganda. Murray, in an interview with Barry Weiss on her podcast, discusses the importance of sharing ideas. He recalls being a left-wing university student with strong opinions on Israel. Another young man in his dorm room, he recalls, was far more well-versed on the history of the region, and he ultimately schooled Murray and sent him on a trajectory that landed him where he is today. For Murray, this story is a rationale for speaking. He argues that one should share one's thoughts because you really never know how an idea is going to land with another person and how it might even shape their opinion on a particular issue or even modify their entire worldview. But from my perspective, it makes an equally compelling argument for listening. All right, so this has been a Blighted Pine book review. Hope you have found it interesting. If you did so, please like the video, please subscribe below, and I'll see you in the next one. All right, hope you have a really awesome rest of your day.